It was supposed to be a routine drive, nothing out of the ordinary. Celeste Monroe, dressed in a tailored blazer and flat shoes, had just left a quiet community center in Edgewood. The sun was lowering behind pine trees, casting a soft amber glow across the two-lane road she traveled. Her rental car moved steadily, well under the speed limit. No loud music, no reckless turns. She wasn't in a rush. She wasn't hiding. In fact, everything about her was designed to blend in until it didn't. As she approached a roadside checkpoint just past the county line, Celeste noticed the cruiser parked at an angle. A single officer stood waiting, arms crossed, sunglasses on, posture rigid. She slowed, pulled over as instructed, and rolled her window halfway. The officer didn't offer a greeting. He didn't explain the stop. He only asked, in a clipped tone, for her to step out of the vehicle. Celeste, calm but cautious, asked why. "I set out," the officer repeated, now raising his voice. She didn't argue. She simply responded, "Am I being detained?" That was the moment everything shifted. Without warning, the officer pulled her door open, grabbed her arm, and forced her from the car. The pavement was hot beneath her hands as she was pinned down. Her face turned slightly toward the cruiser's tire. Dust floated in the air. A passing truck slowed, then kept moving. She didn't shout. She didn't flinch. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. The officer, whose badge read L. Danner, ignored her words and radioed in the stop. "Female suspect. Uncooperative. Detained for further questioning." But within 10 minutes, as he sat in the cruiser drafting up his report, something happened that had never happened to him before. His radio crackled, and a call came through, not from his local dispatch, not even from State Patrol, but from a federal line he didn't recognize. "Officer Danner, do not proceed. Release the individual immediately, and stay where you are." Silence followed. He looked at the woman sitting silently in the back of his cruiser. Her expression hadn't changed. She was still, composed, waiting, and that's when it hit him. He hadn't just pulled over a woman on a quiet road. He had touched something bigger, someone connected. But it wasn't about fear, it was about consequences. In that single moment, Officer Danner began to understand that this wasn't just about a traffic stop. It was about a system watching him back. And this time, it had a name, a badge, and a memory far longer than his own. Celeste Monroe didn't move for several minutes after the door closed behind her in the back seat of the patrol car. Her wrists, still tight from the cuffs, rested on her lap. She didn't look around. She didn't ask questions. She waited. That's something Celeste had always done better than most. Wait, observe, remember. She had built an entire career on knowing exactly when to speak and when silence carried more power. Officer Danner had no idea who he was dealing with. To him, she was just another quiet black woman in a clean car on a quiet road. No threat, no badge, no voice worth listening to. But what he didn't know was that Celeste wasn't on that road by chance. She had been in Edgewood for 10 weeks under a different name, renting a small, furnished apartment just off Main Street, attending local meetings, visiting community centers, listening. Her work was never loud. It wasn't designed to make headlines. She was a federal investigator assigned by the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Justice. Her focus identifying towns where law enforcement patterns showed consistent, unchecked bias. Places where citizens of color were detained at significantly higher rates. where complaints disappeared into silence, where the same names kept reappearing in misconduct reports that never reached a courtroom. Edgewood had fit the pattern almost too perfectly. Celeste had reviewed nearly every dashcam video from the department in the past 2 years, studied complaint files, cross-referenced badge numbers. There were patterns subtle but unmistakable. Officer Danner's name appeared often, not always in reports, but in footnotes, in supervisor notes, in side comments made by fellow officers during internal reviews. He was known for being direct, the kind of officer who handled things in the moment. Celeste knew what that meant. It meant people walked away shaken, silenced, but too intimidated to file anything formal. She had compiled all of it in her encrypted notes. Timestamps, locations, vehicle descriptions. Her mission was never personal, but this traffic stop had just made it so. At the station, Danner logged her as a Jane Doe. No ID on file, no matches in local databases. The name Celeste Monroe didn't appear in the system because her cover identity was clean and compartmentalized. She watched as he filled out the incident report with practiced ease. Suspect displayed non-compliance. Physical restraint required. No visible injuries. He didn't know the dashboard camera had already synced to a DOJ server the moment his cruiser crossed the federal surveillance zone marked for this exact experiment. Edgewood PD had unknowingly become part of a federal oversight test. Celeste was the variable they weren't told it existed. Back at her apartment, her secure laptop sat idle open on an encrypted report titled Edgewood PD Internal Conduct, Preliminary Findings. Her last entry, written just 12 hours before, detailed the patterns of escalation used by officers when interacting with female drivers of color. She had seen it before. What she hadn't anticipated was being part of the data herself. While she sat quietly in that holding cell, a chain reaction had already begun. A DOJ analyst in DIOT flagged her status as compromised and immediately activated an internal alert. Her location pinged off a DOJ-tracked rental vehicle. That triggered a cascade of communications across encrypted lines, landing on the desk of her supervisor, who only needed one glance at the alert to pick up the phone. The call to Edgewood PD wasn't a warning. It was a command. Officer Danner wouldn't know the full story until much later. But the woman he'd handcuffed on the side of the road had spent her entire adult life working inside the systems he took for granted, building cases brick by brick, policy by policy, report by report. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to pull rank. All she had to do was let the system he thought would protect him show him what happened when it worked for someone else. And it was just beginning. The holding room was quiet, except for the occasional buzz of a flickering ceiling light. Officer Danner stood outside the door with a paper cup of lukewarm coffee in hand. He'd done the paperwork, logged the stop, noted civil disobedience, and attached the dashcam file like always. Routine, clean, until the captain called him back to the front desk. "You logged this in yet?" the captain asked without looking up. "Already filed," Danner replied. The captain handed him the phone, lips pressed tight. "Take it." On the line was a woman's voice, level and professional. "Are you Officer Luke Danner?" he confirmed. She paused for half a beat. "You are to release the individual in holding room 2 immediately. No further contact. Do not engage. Do not ask questions. That is a direct order from the Department of Justice." Danner blinked. "Excuse me." The voice didn't repeat herself. "You'll be receiving a formal notice of suspension within the hour. Return your badge and firearm to the desk sergeant. Compliance is not optional. He stood frozen, unsure what stunned him more, that someone in Washington had eyes on this, or that his captain was nodding, already aware. That moment cracked something open inside him. All those years of feeling untouchable on the streets of Edgewood, the unfiled complaints, the dismissed cell phone videos, the smirks exchanged behind mirrored sunglasses, none of it had prepared him for the weight of a federal voice saying, "You're done." The station was quiet when Celeste walked out, her wrist lightly bruised, but her posture unshaken. No one made eye contact. A black sedan with no loud idled at the curb. She opened the door without needing to explain herself. Inside, a woman in a gray suit greeted her with a simple nod. "We've already pulled the footage. They're processing the disciplinary orders now. Danner is being placed on immediate leave. Full DOJ oversight request has been signed." Celeste didn't respond right away. She watched the town slide past her window, the quiet streets, the bakery where she sometimes sat anonymously, the town hall she had walked through as Ms. Ellis just a week earlier to observe a city council meeting that never mentioned policing, but had budgeted for riot gear. Now the same council would receive an inquiry letter with her real name signed at the bottom. The DOJ wasn't just reacting to a single incident. They were bringing the weight of federal procedure. Back at the station, officers shuffled uneasily. No one had seen it coming. No sirens, no headlines, just one woman walking in silence and a phone call that changed the air in the building. The camera footage had been reviewed not just by the DOJ, but also, silently, by one of the city's own attorneys, who recognized Celeste from a briefing 6 months ago. The Internal Affairs Unit, usually slow to act, was told to expedite. Within 24 hours, Luke Danner's badge number was flagged across multiple state systems. A week later, in a closed-door meeting inside the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, Celeste sat across from a panel of investigators, handing over a carefully prepared digital file. The title on the first page read, "Edgewood PD, Pattern and Practice Review Confidential Summary." The data inside wasn't new. She had spent months building it. What was new was that her own experience had become Exhibit A. What began as fieldwork had become a case file. Names were listed, incidents cataloged. The pattern was undeniable. Over-policing in minority neighborhoods, unjustified searches, absence of body cam footage in escalated cases, dozens of civilian testimonies, anonymized but clear. It was no longer just about Danner. It was about what allowed him to feel confident doing what he did in the first place. Celeste wasn't interested in vengeance. She was interested in structural change. And now, her story one of silence, of power held back, of patience was about to fuel a federal review process that could bring oversight to an entire county. The DOJ would recommend that Edgewood's department either enter into a consent decree or face federal litigation. Either way, things wouldn't go back to how they were. The quiet traffic stop had become a lever, not because she shouted, but because she didn't. And yet, for all the weight of paperwork and hearings, there remained one last ripple. Celeste didn't plan for something personal, something human, something that reminded her that sometimes change isn't always delivered from the top down. Sometimes it walks up to you, quietly, not in uniform, not in fear, but in reflection. What happened next didn't come from the DOJ. It came from someone who had been watching, someone unexpected. And what he had to say would shift the tone not of the case, but of the reckoning Celeste had spent her life preparing for. It started with a letter. 3 weeks after the DOJ inquiry began, Celeste received an envelope in the mail. No official header. Just a plain white envelope with her name, her real name, written in slightly shaky pen. She paused. Few people had that name connected to this address. Fewer still would use it in handwriting. She opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note, short, hesitant, and unexpected. Ms. Monroe, I've never written anything like this. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I've been watching the hearings. I didn't know who you were. That's not an excuse. I don't know what it means to change yet, but I'd like to learn. Luke Danner. Celeste sat still for a long time after reading. Not angry, not moved, simply thoughtful. She had spent her life dealing with structures, institutions, agencies that moved slowly but definitively. Rarely did she see personal accountability come before public consequence, and even rarer someone willing to say, without an audience, that they were ready to unlearn. She didn't respond right away. Meanwhile, the federal review expanded. What started as a single department probe was now turning into a broader conversation across counties. Other officers from Edgewood began coming forward, not to deny but to quietly corroborate patterns they had once been told to ignore. A young Latina officer, only a year on the job, testified anonymously that she had been reprimanded for questioning Danner's stops. A dispatcher leaked internal memos showing racial profiling codes used unofficially in call logs. Celeste didn't push these disclosures. She simply let space exist. And in that space, truth began to find its way through. Her approach was never vengeance. It was exposure, not to humiliate individuals, but to let systems see themselves in a mirror too clear to deny. One morning, as Celeste was leaving a modest cafe just outside of Edgewood, she noticed a familiar figure sitting alone near the window. Plain jeans, no badge, head lowered. It was Luke. He didn't look up right away. When he did, he stood but didn't approach, just a simple nod. She walked over, unsure if she'd say anything. But she sat down. For the first few minutes, there were no words, just the hum of coffee machines and passing cars. Then he spoke. I used to think I understood what the job meant. Protect, serve, but I only protected people who looked like me. I didn't see that then. You, being quiet. That scared me more than yelling ever would. You knew something I didn't. That the system wasn't mine to own. Celeste watched him, eyes steady. You made the call, didn't you? He asked. She shook her head. No, I didn't have to. The system you didn't believe could turn on itself. Did. Not because of me, because of you. He absorbed that. Quietly. Then offered a weak smile. Fair enough. Celeste declined to press charges against Danner personally. The DOJ already had a disciplinary path underway. Instead, she proposed something else radical in its simplicity. Community-facing reform workshops, not led by lawyers or consultants, but by former officers, victims of profiling, and investigators like her, not to perform reconciliation, to practice accountability. She didn't ask Danner to participate as he asked her, and months later, when Edgewood hosted its first community police dialogue forum, the man at the microphone wasn't in uniform. He was in a plain shirt, no title, reading a short reflection about how power feels invisible when it belongs to you, and overwhelming when it's pointed at you. That night, Celeste sat at her desk with a pen in hand and began writing not to Danner, but to a young black woman she'd met years ago during another investigation. The woman had once asked her, "What's the point of all this? They never change." Celeste had answered then with statistics and policy names, but tonight her answer was different. She wrote, "They don't all change, but one does, then another, and it's not fast, but it's real, and sometimes we get to be the reason they even start to look in the mirror." In the end, Celeste's strength wasn't in the call from Washington. It wasn't in her title or her badge. It was in her silence, in her ability to let the system reveal itself, to give it no excuse to turn away. She didn't use power to crush. She used truth to confront. And sometimes, that's enough to bend something that once felt immovable. Celeste Monroe didn't stay in Edgewood. Her work there was done, but her presence lingered in the meeting notes of the city council, in the quiet reforms now being pushed through the department, and in the memory of one traffic stop that unfolded like so many others, until it didn't. She returned to Washington with no fanfare, no press, and no headlines. That's how she preferred it. Her legacy wasn't measured in noise, it was measured in motion. A ripple here, a policy there, a shift in someone's voice when they said, "Ma'am," not with suspicion, but with respect. And maybe most of all, it was measured in the space she created for reflection, not only in those she challenged, but in those who had nearly given up believing change was possible at all. She never told her full story. That traffic stop, the one that could have gone so much worse, remained a line in her own private history, a test of her restraint, her focus, her clarity. She didn't slam a badge on the table. She didn't raise her voice. She let the system reveal itself, because she knew true power doesn't need to shout. It watches, it remembers, it acts when it matters most. And for Officer Danner, his story didn't end with disgrace. It didn't end in jail. It ended with accountability, with humility, with the slow, often painful realization that the badge he wore didn't make him immune to consequences. In fact, it made him more responsible. And maybe, in a quiet corner of himself, he was grateful that someone like Celeste had been the one to teach him that lesson before the next stop, the next mistake, the next irreversible harm. Sometimes justice comes with lights and sirens, but sometimes it arrives in silence, wearing a navy blue blazer, and leaves behind only a question. Who are we when no one's watching? That question stayed with everyone who heard her story. And maybe that's the point. We don't need heroes with capes or villains with mustaches. We need people who show up, who refuse to be erased, who carry the burden of being underestimated and still lead with integrity. So the next time someone says, "It was just a traffic stop," remember Celeste Monroe, and remember what happened after the call from Washington.